Before I begin, thank you very much, Brittany, for that warm introduction. Thank you to the mayor. Thank you all for being here. And this is clearly a place that really cares about its community, because that's why you're all here. I will tell you, I've driven cross-country 6 times. I do all sorts of work all over the country. What Brittany said, I just want to really reinforce. You have a very, very special place. I mean, when people start talking about the relationship between the urban and rural, you had me at hello. I mean, that's kind of like the gift that keeps on giving. Very few places in our country actually even have that conversation. And so this gift that was bestowed to all of you in 1958, maybe many of you were part of it, is a very special gift. And I would argue that it's given you an identity in terms of, you know, your city where people mainly live, where people work, and your countryside where there's a very special topography that's given you this equestrian culture, that's given you bourbon, that's given you all of these wonderful things. Those things are special and unique. And the more I travel the world, the more I realize that places are getting less unique. So before you let go of that boundary, really think about what it gives you in terms of the unique things that are Lexington. So I wanted then to think about that and think about this question of growth, because clearly the Fayette Alliance is focused on this idea of smart growth. That term has been around for well over 3 decades now. And so I wanted to start kind of biggest picture, right? Where are we growing? How are we growing? And for whom? The United Nations estimates that by the end of this century, actually before, we'll have kind of peak population growth around the world, and that we're going to grow from about our 8.4 billion people to about 10.5 billion people. Most of those people will live in cities and suburbs. Rural population will probably stay kind of level to where it was in the 1950s. And then it will start to decline. And so the UN has been updating these numbers. But what's interesting is buried in that is actually a second series of trends, which is in most of the developed world, in the United States and Western Europe, in much of East Asia, you have declining birth rates. So you actually have birth rate. I mean, there are some countries like South Korea that are actually in the middle of a crisis because they don't have enough workers to support their retired folks, the people that we need to kind of keep working in our society. Most of the growth that's happening in the world isn't even where you'd expect. China's kind of leveled out. India, my home country, is going to plateau soon. And what you see is much of the African subcontinent, much of Asia outside of China and India is where really the growth is expected to happen. And so you understand what's going to happen in the world, right? There's going to be more pressure from the global south to come in and have workers in the places where housing and infrastructure have been built. And you can then cue Springfield, Ohio from last year as just a little microcosm of what you're going to continue to see worldwide, right, as those pressures change. And you know, a lot of people get quite worried when I talk about the idea that we might have 2 billion more neighbors on the planet. I mean, obviously, if you're concerned with climate change, you might think that that is a really disastrous thing. But I'd encourage you to look at this pair of charts, which what you're seeing on the left is where carbon emissions are largely concentrated per person. On the right is where the growth is happening population-wise, and you'll see that they're almost the converse of each other. So really, the places where we use the most carbon are the places that have the least amount of population growth. And you can zoom in even further. This is fairly recent data from Berkeley. That's obviously the northeastern seaboard. And what you see there is something quite extraordinary, talking about the connection between urban and rural. That carbon emissions per capita are quite low in big cities like New York, where I live, and quite low in rural areas. It's everything in between where you really see the problem, right? And what's interesting is, I mean, there are many people here who know rural America, but you think about rural America, even though it's spread out, it's still conservation culture. You don't get into your truck and drive 80 miles to get a quart of milk. You really think about how you use resources. It's in that zone in the middle where everything from landscaping to the heating and cooling of small single-family homes, where you get into more and more trouble in terms of carbon emissions. And so, sprawl really is a big issue. As I said, I've driven cross-country 6 times. It's amazing how much of this very beautiful country we are losing to kind of this anonymous form of development. And the thing is that no matter how much green tech you add to it, no matter how many solar panels and electric cars and windmills you add to it, you can't deal with the other forms of loss that come with living on more land than you need to live on, right? From loss of wetlands, loss of farming, and loss of community, which I'm going to talk about more in a second. The other thing is sprawl is largely what we build in terms of housing in this country. You'll remember the housing crisis of the 2000s. It's not making housing more affordable. I hear this time and time again, that we can't afford especially young people, older people who are maybe empty nesters, can't afford to live anymore, and so we need to build more suburban subdivision. Well, show me a piece of data that shows that somehow made life more affordable for Americans. You can't find it. And in the last 5 years, and I think this actually fueled a lot of kind of the political anger that went into this last election. I mean, think about this, that to own the average home in the United States, your salary needed to nearly double over the last 5 years. And that is a real crisis for our children, our grandchildren, in terms of how they're going to afford to live in the country. And so I think we need to take a big step back and think about how we do this as a society. One of my favorite economists, because she draws with a pencil, named Kate Raworth, she teaches at Oxford. She wrote this great little book that I really recommend called Donut Economics. And she draws this diagram. And she basically says, if we're going to think about the world growing in the ways we just described in terms of population, let's not just talk about growth for growth's sake, but think about how we could all live. And she basically argues that we should all try to live inside of that donut. Right? That if you undershoot that donut, people have shortfalls in terms of how they live, whether they can afford to give their kids basic necessities, education, healthcare, and so forth. But if you overshoot the donut, you use more resources than the planet can really afford to give you. And so the problem we have, it seems to me, in our society is that most people either live on one side of this donut or the other. And very few of us actually think about whether we can live inside of the donut. And that's a real crisis if you've got a growing world. So I was born in India. My parents emigrated here in the 60s as part of a huge kind of chain of events that happened worldwide. By about the mid-1990s to now, about 2 billion people have entered the middle class worldwide. China, India, Turkey, Russia, Brazil, you name it. The only issue is a lot of those folks that have made it out of poverty, which is a great thing, have decided that their definition of success is one that we kind of created here of the single-family house and a couple of cars in the driveway. And just think about it. I mean, think about if billions of people decide to live that way around the world. So these are 6 images from 6 continents around the world. And so, to me, this is a real tragedy in terms of how we think about the beauty of the planet and how we use it. And you can see the same thing whether you go outside of Riyadh or you go outside of Phoenix, an irrigated desert where we're building this. Now, I've been beating up on suburbs, but I don't think our cities are doing much better. And this is what I mean about identity. These are 6 cities from around the world and downtowns, and they are becoming equally banal, equally kind of nameless and placeless, where you land and you see the same Starbucks at the bottom of the same blue glass building, and you don't know whether you're in Shanghai or Dubai or Mumbai. It's all kind of the same. And yet, the pandemic should prove something to all of us, which is, when the telephone was invented, people thought that would be the end of cities. that we'd all work from the mountaintop. And then we had this ultimate test during the pandemic, right? Where we have the technology to supposedly seamlessly work without having to be in the same space. And yet, in every city I go to around the country, you can't get a restaurant reservation. It's incredible, right? We like doing this. You could have all seen this online, right? But we do this as a species. We like to be with one another. And we have, since the beginning of really antiquity, since we became Homo sapiens, built what I would call urbanity. We've built different forms of collective living on every continent, every culture, right? And we've done this primarily not just for economic reasons, for trade. Because if we did it just for trade, all of these places would have looked the same. But they don't. They have all sorts of interesting and different cultural norms. In ancient China, if you went north on the grid, you were ascending to the heavens. In ancient India, if you spiraled in the grid, you were finding spirituality at the center. William Penn founded the grid of Philadelphia based on the idea of an egalitarian grid that was designed in ancient Athens. And so we've been creating urban form as a species for a long, long time. And so I want you to do something with me as we go on this journey, which is to separate the idea of urbanity from size. So if I say the word urban, you probably would think big, city slickers, wearing black, flying in from Manhattan. But I'm going to argue that urbanity is a cultural condition. And it can be just as manifest in a small town in Japan as it could. Anyone recognize the center slide? Goodwood, Canada, otherwise known as, anyone? Schitt's Creek. Or the densest place in the world, one of the greenest places in the world, Hong Kong. It can happen at all scales. And I pulled back this picture specifically for this lecture. I took this picture flying out of Narita Airport years and years ago outside of Tokyo. This is a farming village in Japan, and it's actually very similar to the farming village that my father grew up in India, where if you take a close look at that picture, that is basically the idea of an urban growth boundary without it being legally enforced, but it being culturally enforced. And just think about infrastructure. Think about the fact that all the farmers, after they farm their land, they come back and they have one line of infrastructure in terms of water, sewer, power. But that line is also their cultural connection to each other, right? And so this idea of urbanity has nothing to do with size. So in my most recent book, I talk about urbanity not about size, but actually about this idea of urbanity being this thing that celebrates difference. And that can happen in a small village or a big metropolis, or you can segregate difference, and that can happen in a small village, or it can happen in a big metropolis. And I talk about urbanity as opposed to community because in our field, in architecture and urban planning, we talk about community a lot. Community is a very important idea. But sometimes the challenge with the idea of community is that we get tribal, right? We like to hang out with people who think like us, who pray like us, who vote like us. And we already have a set of algorithms in social media that are already doing this to us. So we don't need to reinforce it in physical space. We have this other data, and thank you to the AARP for sponsoring us, in terms of public health and mental health. Because there's all this data. There's a great book called The Good Life that talks about longevity and people having a good life through many decades. It's one of the longest studies of human happiness ever conducted at Harvard University. And it found that if you controlled for things like smoking and exercise, that the other big variable was social connection, right? The ability for people to have strong social connections is imperative in terms of longevity and public health. So as an architect, I asked myself, what are the spaces that create great social connection? And I think urbanity has a lot to do with that. And then finally, this is a university town, and ideas are fundamental to this idea of urbanity, right? So there's a Greek city planner named Doxiadis who kind of made this diagram. This was long before there were blue states and red states, where the idea that every once in a while an iconoclast was born, someone who thought differently than the people around them, and that they sought out denser and denser circumstances to find other people like them. And those people created social progress movements by being together and actually being kind of contagious in society. This could be a diagram of the Arab Spring. And so one of the things that I think is fundamental to urbanity is this idea of public space, not just as a place for an office worker to have a sandwich, which is fine, but also as a place of sort of serendipity, whether that's a park where for years in the city, it isn't true anymore, but that they didn't have water for the swimming pool and people turned it into an event space. Or Norman Foster's Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which also turns into a place where a lot of Filipino maids come and hang out on Sundays under the shade of the skyscraper. This idea that we use urban space to come together in different ways that the designers didn't even have in mind. And so in my profession, in architecture, and I'm going to talk about the connection of architecture to this idea of urbanity in a second, increasingly, these are all recent Pritzker Prize winners who are building a lot of work around this idea of urbanity. Here, we're also seeing new forms of social housing and urban housing in the global south. And you know, what's interesting is I'm always amused when people say that the things I'm talking about cost more money. Actually, some of the best examples of the things I'm talking about occur in the global south where means are incredibly limited, like that mosque that's also a community center, that's also a flood refuge zone in Dhaka, or timber yards housing in Dublin, Ireland. So there's examples all over the world. There's examples in cities that mayors are doing all over the world in terms of reclaiming streets for people, building interesting forms of public transit, new forms of housing that are going up in Vienna and Paris that are inviting immigrants, which is a new thing for Central Europe, decking over highways in Dallas and Madrid. There's all sorts of interesting things that are going on. And so these are the things I like to think about and write about. And so these are my two books, and I put these up here because I thought it was really interesting in terms of the context of Lexington and maybe some of the debates you're having. So my first book came out almost 12 years ago now, was a plea for things like transit-oriented density and for urban growth boundaries. And actually, if you've been reading this book, Abundance, that has now seemed to have caught fire around the country, I'm glad the political and reporter class have noticed things that architects and urban planners have been talking about for decades. But this idea that we need to build more urban housing, we need to build more affordable housing, we need to build more infrastructure. That's a lot of what the first book was about, and it had a lot of data and graphics in it. But I realized there was a problem. As I lectured around the country around that first book, I thought there was going to be this big blue-red divide. There wasn't at all. What I found instead was that people would say to me, Vishaan, I get it, I get what you're saying, but you're saying like we need to build a bunch of new housing and we need to build all of these things, but most of what we build is terrible. Most of what we build is soul-crushing in our new urban landscapes. And that really gave me pause. And that actually launched the 7-year project to do this next book, which is much more about the quality of places, not just the quantity of the things that we're building, which is my little beef with this abundance argument. Because you can't get people to accept quantity without quality. And so that's also the basis of our firm, Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, or POW for short. We came out of the gate about 10 years ago with a mission statement. We also did this crazy thing of saying what we don't do, which all my architect friends thought we were crazy to state, but there you go. And that's our office today. It's very diverse, lots of people from around the world. And we focus on a series of practice areas: housing, infrastructure, cultural and educational work, workspace is the future. We try to center everything on thought leadership, and we try to surround everything with a sense of co-design, of working with communities in terms of how the work we do serves people. So we do a lot of different kinds of work. It's mainly architecture. It's mainly in the United States. And I wanted to talk about a few of these as case studies of this idea of urbanity. And I want to start not with New York City, not with a big project, but a place that's very near and dear to my heart, that's very close to here, Columbus, Indiana. Not Columbus, Ohio, Columbus, Indiana. Small town of about 50,000 people, it's much smaller than Lexington, Kentucky. And if you know anything about Columbus, you know this is the headquarters of Cummins Engine. A man named Irwin Miller turned Cummins Engine into a juggernaut. And he and his wife Xenia were big architecture buffs. And they helped build up this town, and they hired the first Saarinen to do the first Unitarian church, and then they hired his son, Eero Saarinen, who did Dulles Airport and a lot of other very famous buildings around the world, to do their home, and then I.M. Pei did their library, and they started paying for all of this architecture. And so if you haven't been to Columbus, please make a pilgrimage to Columbus. It's an extraordinary place. And towards the end of their lives, the Millers set up this thing called the Miller Prize, which was meant for new architects to come and build there. And we got a phone call one day that said that you've won the Miller Prize and they give you a certain amount of money to build something that helps the town. And I wanted to start with this because you guys are having a debate about an urban growth boundary. And I think that's incredibly important as a public debate. The Greeks used to have this word, the omphalos, which means the belly button, the navel. And it's one of my favorite words because it's about the center of the center. And so if we're going to encourage people to be in a center, you have to give people great cause to be there, it seems to me. It has to be a great place. And you have a great place here. You have a lot of assets. So in downtown Columbus, we were given this mission, say, here's a little chunk of money. What could you build? That's a small thing. That's a piece of acupuncture that could actually make our community better. And so we went out to the local high school and we did a lot of Zoom meetings, and then that's the city engineer sitting next to me to my right there, Dave Hayward, who we got kind of high on ice cream and got him to take out kind of the one stoplight in the one stoplight town. And we proposed to create this gathering place in the main intersection of downtown. And when we could take out the stoplights, I had foundations and I had power, right, to put this little canopy structure on. It's not like a miraculous piece of architecture, but we had to general contract it, and we built it in a few weeks, actually. It's out there right now in downtown Columbus, and it's meant to be a canvas for people to use. And what was extraordinary about this is, so the mayor was a little nervous because she's like, can trucks drive under it? And I'm like, yes, Mayor, trucks can drive under it. And she said, but won't this mean that a lot of people in the community are going to ask to close this intersection for festivals and events? And I said, Mayor, I hope so. And they have. And so on nights and weekends, and everyone complains about traffic. There's like 4 cars an hour. Right? It's a street grid. I mean, if you saw that image before, like there's plenty of places for the cars to go. But what's amazing is all these diverse communities came out of the woodwork, and they've said to me time and time again that they never felt an invitation to have their celebrations and festivals downtown until this little canopy structure was made available. And it has lighting, and it has a sound system. And so all of this happened in ruby red Indianapolis, right? And so it's had Pride Week, and it's had parties, and it sits out there in the snow. And it's real proof to me that it's not really about the architecture. It's this idea that whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more, which is a quote from Aldo van Eyck, one of my favorite 20th century architects, which means that like the architecture isn't what has meaning, it's how people give it meaning. So just up the road in Indianapolis, we just opened a little bridge that has a very similar kind of phenomena. Again, beautiful landscape, beautiful topography. I've learned a lot from my landscape architecture friends about how to make sure that you center this in your thinking early on, just like you have this extraordinarily unique piece of topography here. This is a land of rivers. And this is downtown Indianapolis, believe it or not. Like right over that treescape is the skyline of Indianapolis. This is Fall Creek, and it's right near the hospital zone and this new industrial zone called 16 Tech, and Riverside, which is historically a kind of marginalized African-American community, that never had connections to those hospitals where many people work from that community. And so, again, this was all during the pandemic. Zoom has turned out to be a great community engagement tool. We find that people come to Zoom meetings that don't necessarily go to community board meetings because it's not as much of a time commitment. It's easier. There's a Zoom polling function. We heard a lot from people about how they wanted this bridge to be more about people than cars. So we convinced Indianapolis DOT to have the bridge be only one lane in each direction so that we could separate the bike traffic from the walking and jogging traffic. It's a big trail city, Indianapolis, because of all these trees. And most importantly, we wanted to respect the landscape. And so we didn't want the bridge to be taller than the trees, and we wanted the structure of the bridge to respect the tree canopy and echo the tree canopy in terms of its branches. And so that was the initial diagram, and that just opened 2 months ago. So it's lit, it's out there. The opening was kind of glorious. You see the hospitals in the background. You see how it sits in the tree canopy. And people just sit and they use it and they celebrate. It's great. So over now up, and again, we do a lot of work throughout the industrial Midwest, and I include Niagara Falls in that, even though it's part of New York State, it's really part of the Erie Canal system. And incredible history. The city hired us to look at a lot of your vacant lots. Now, I just want to, and I'm going to talk about this a little later as well, the vacant lot study that Fayette Alliance did is so important in terms of understanding. People always think they're out of land in cities. It always amazes me. And they always think they're out of parking. You are not out of land and you are not out of parking. I assure you, right? And I have to assure every community of this. So the state hired us because they had done all this urban renewal in downtown Niagara, has this incredible history. I won't go through it all. But all of these beautiful old buildings that were industrial juggernauts that got torn down. Again, a lot of community engagement, a lot of recommendations. This is super important, not just for the long term, but what happens in the interim on empty lots is super, super important, how to put places on people's cognitive map. So we're in the midst of building out a 1.5 mile long heritage trail in Niagara Falls, which is about the size of the High Line, which is something I worked on in New York City, with kind of incredible points of history about power and food, about the Underground Railroad, which Niagara Falls was very much a part of, about lighting, and again, interim uses, future uses, trying to get more housing to happen downtown. So it's not just, again, about the quantity of housing units you build downtown, but how do you incentivize it through acupuncture, through these open space elements that I've been talking about. New outlooks over the Niagara River for the community, not less for tourists. And so now I'm going to talk about New York a little bit just to close. So I won't go through the details of this. This is a massive, massive master plan we did for the city of New York. It's 185 acres, biggest open site in New York City. It's an active rail yard. It's Amtrak's biggest rail kind of servicing facility. And there it sits, so you see it's about a 12-minute subway ride from Midtown Manhattan. Extraordinary piece of infrastructure that sits out there, tough edge conditions. And we started this, and so this is another thing in terms of this kind of growth that we're talking about here tonight. I do not believe that urban growth is synonymous with towers. And in fact, we inherited a plan on this site that said, let's just build towers wherever we can between the rail tracks. And I worked with a structural engineer and said, no, we can build a tabletop and build mid-scale density on that tabletop and have a much more humane condition. And that is mid-scale density for New York. And so we did this plan. And again, a lot of things around green infrastructure, visualizations to help the community understand what kind of growth we were talking about there. Obviously a very different scale of growth because this is New York. But the most important thing here was the infrastructure. Get the park right, get the train station right. Development will always follow the right infrastructure. So that's true in small scale, whether you're building a canopy over an intersection in Columbus, Indiana, or a major train station in New York City. It's always about that. I wanted to also talk about adaptive reuse. You have a beautiful historic fabric here in Lexington. And we're living in a post-pandemic world in terms of what office space might be. This has been a super interesting project for us. This is one of our first built projects. This is on the Brooklyn waterfront. It's this old sugar refinery. At my former firm, we did the master plan and a glorious park designed by field operations. This is, again, a place that brings groups of people that heretofore had not interacted in Brooklyn together at this park. It's just absolutely glorious. And then we were given the assignment to put a creative office building in that sugar refinery, which is it's a landmark building. And it was built in 3 phases. None of the windows line up. We did this drawing. This is what the inside looked like in terms of sugar refining equipment. Don't eat refined sugar, it's really gross how they make it. But unless it's in your bourbon. So the facade was a lie. The windows were a lie. It was all housing this equipment behind it. And that's what the inside of the building looked like. And so one of the things that I think is really important with new growth, and again, with this idea of identity and authenticity, is to be able to tell the right story. So we went to the Landmarks Commission with this photograph and said, basically, we want to do something different. We want to insert a new building inside of the old building. And kind of like the way you have this equipment with these steel tiebacks that hold up that brick facade, we proposed that new office building with a new set of steel tiebacks that hold up the brick facade. So it would snow and rain in that space. And that's how you deal with all the mismatched windows and so forth. And so that's what we went off and built. The round arch at the top comes from the fact that these old industrial buildings were built in the American round arch style. That's because they used to have fires all the time, so they finally got rid of the wood lintel to hold up the brick above it and put a brick arch in. We wanted to pay homage to that. It also was very structurally efficient. And so there it is out there today. That is not a rendering. And there's the space between the new building and the old building. Our landscape architect, Lisa Switkin, came up with this amazing idea to turn this into a vertical garden. So there are 23 pin oak trees growing in the gap between the new building and the old building. It's absolutely extraordinary. And talk about a different environment to bring workers to in a post-pandemic world. So this is really leasing. People love it. It's extraordinary to be in this space and kind of have this sense of nature, have these views of the city and the East River beyond, and then the history of the building in terms of that brick patina. It can't be in Shanghai or Mumbai or Dubai. It can only be where it is in Brooklyn. It's part of the story of the place. And that's just to give you a sense of this bakery that opened, people doing planks up at the top. It's really quite extraordinary. And then finally, very, very important, how the building meets the ground. So we work with the Landmarks Commission to turn all the windows into doors all around the building, so it flows out into the park around it. And so it's starting to populate and really activate that park. And so there's this way in which this building is about growth and change, but it's also about history and narrative, and it pulls history forward with it. And so I think this is an example of how, if you're going to tell communities that you want to build a lot of housing, you want to build a lot of stuff in a neighborhood, well, how can you do that while also embracing the place that you're in? And I think that's very, very important. And again, people kind of really love it. And then finally, I'm going to close with housing. So it's funny, not that far away in Brooklyn from the Domino site, but a world away, is this project. One of the poorest parts of Brooklyn, a lot of crime statistics. My client is the pastor, Reverend A.R. Bernard, who built this church in the 70s. And you can see that there's various forms of public housing near it. This is out near Kennedy Airport. His congregation now has 30,000 people. It's really quite an extraordinary place. And developers had been approaching him for years to develop his 11-acre parking lot. And he had always kicked them out until we met. and I'm not a developer, I'm working for the developer, but he and I sort of had this mind meld around these goals that he had, and those are his goals, those 6. And it's near transit, and it's got this really interesting kind of neighborhood context of big and small. And I drew this sketch for him now 8 years ago, this dumb sketch on my iPad. And all it says is something really simple, that we're going to build housing on the perimeter to create a street wall, which is a typical New York condition. We're going to invite the neighboring streets in, which is those red lines. We're going to open up the place to southern sunlight, which is that yellow line. And then in the middle of the site, we're going to create a destination, not just around his church, but he wanted to build a school and a performing arts center and really serve the community. He had also, interestingly, read his Jane Jacobs. And so he knew about the qualities that make great urbanity, including diversity and lots of street entrances. And one of the things that's an article of faith among architects and planners in cities is that we put retail on the ground floor to help activate the streetscape. There's enough retail demand here to support a grocery store, maybe a small cafe, that's about it. And so we had ended up infusing the ground floor with social infrastructure. So for example, a lot of the people in his church need 24/7 daycare because they work the night shift at McDonald's. They need vocational training. And so that's what the ground floor is infused with. And so it's not very tall, it's about mid-scale. Again, that very important ground floor. Parking tucked away in places where we could find spaces for parking, a bunch of green things I won't go through. And then these renderings, and working with this community for about 2 years to get their buy-in in terms of what the streetscape would look like. The local council member wanted brick. We have some home ownership units, which are those 2-story maisonettes. And I'll tell you, this is very low budget, and it's not capital A architecture like Domino is, or other things that we work on. But for us, the importance here was to not make something that screams affordable housing, but instead something that imbues people's lives with dignity. So we put a lot of budget into the front doors and the entries to make people feel like when they got home, it was their home. And so that's the Performing Arts Center in the background. We're raising philanthropic dollars for that. And so this is under construction. And again, it's a very tight budget. It's a very thin brick wall. And I'm making a point of that because of the next thing I'm going to show you. And so we're trying to do the most we can with a very, very tight budget. And so this project took almost 7 years from the time it was conceived to getting public approvals, which is nuts. In the richest city, in the richest country in the world, this is how we provide housing for our people. And that's not anyone's fault in the White House, it's not anyone's fault, but the way we govern ourselves and the crazy processes we put in place to keep bad things from happening, that therefore prevent good things from happening, even though we had great community buy-in within the first couple of years. So there's a couple of things I want to close with in terms of that thought. One is this college we're doing at Princeton, which is, we've designed this building that locks into the campus at Princeton. And it's Hobson College, donated by Melody Hobson, right in the heart of the historic campus. But the thing I really wanted to talk about this was the material palette. We chose this material palette because that's an argillite stone, which makes most of the neo-Gothic buildings at Princeton what they are. That stone's very hard to find. You couldn't find stonemasons that build a stone wall like that anymore. But what we could do is pick a material palette that resonated with it. And so that's the new college, that's a rendering, it's under construction right now. It's meant to emulate the scale of Patton Hall that's right next to it. Terracotta, meant to be a very rich material palette. It's a hybrid timber building, which is a way of saying that it's highly sustainable, it's geothermal. But the thing I just wanted to show is, I was just there a couple of weeks ago to sign off on the brick mock-up. And this is Danish brick. It's a much higher budget than that affordable housing project I showed you just a minute ago, much more wall depth. And I just can't help but think that if we could just get that extra couple of percentage points for the budget to build a wall like this other than that super flat wall. And if I came to you in Lexington, Kentucky, and I said, I want to build a housing project in your neighborhood, that if it had this kind of quality, that maybe I could convince a few more people that like it is actually worthy of being in your community. And so the last thing is, so we did this study quite similar to what Fayette Alliance did, except at a much broader scale for New York City. We were approached by the New York Times editorial board to say, how would we deal with the city's massive housing crisis? We have 100,000 homeless people living in the streets of New York. Many are kids. That got much, much worse during the pandemic. And so people are like, well, it's New York City. I'm sure many of you have been there. It feels like it's completely built up. Where would you possibly put people? And so we did this study for the Times, and they kind of ran with it in a big way, which I was very glad to see because it affected policy making. And this was my central question, which was how could we meet the housing needs of the city without changing our character? It seems to me it's kind of your central question. It's the question that most cities in America that I go to are asking, right? Which is, they understand cities are growing and changing, that our young people can't afford, living the way, maybe we used to live. And just remember, this thing about the single family house, it's not just what the house costs. First of all, it's very, very expensive to build all the infrastructure to get out to that house. I think the people who envisioned your urban growth boundary in 1958 understood that. It's also, what does it cost to own a car, to own 2 cars, to insure them, right? All of that plays into that question. And so then you get in this question of, well, I look outside of my hotel window here in Lexington and I see 8 surface parking lots that absolutely could have housing. But then you might have the question, well, how will that change the look and feel of Lexington? And that's a fair question, right? And so we did this study for the Times, and we said we're not just going to approach this in terms of quantity, but we're going to say, what could the character be in these places? And so we had self-imposed constraints. We said you had to be within a walking distance to mass transit. Very few people own, we have 8.4 million New Yorkers. There's about 1 million privately owned cars in New York City. So very few people own cars, right? And very important, we actually, even though you can build in flood zones, we said we're not going to build in the flood zones. And we found over 10,000 sites that you could build housing on that were either empty surface parking lots or 1-story buildings, twice the size of Central Park. And we said, we had a kind of Goldilocks strategy where we said, there's a low scale, a mid-scale, and a high-rise scale that you could build on various sites depending on the context. And that was part of how we defined neighborhood character. And we basically said for any given empty site, you couldn't build taller than the tallest building within a certain radius. And so this is actually not just a single-family neighborhood. This is up in the Bronx, and it has some multifamily apartment buildings. This was the most controversial one. This is a 6-unit apartment building, but near mass transit. This is in Brooklyn, about a 58-unit building that we proposed over what is a 1-story grocery store that could get replaced at the base of the building. And you can see it's about the same scale as that building to its left. Or in Queens, a much denser area, taller buildings, where we had about a 250-unit building. Add it all up, we found enough land to provide 520,000 housing units near mass transit, out of the flood zone, that could have policy to make it affordable. And that's enough to house over 1 million New Yorkers, right? So this is just, I mean, I know there's a very different scale than what you've done in Lexington, but this is not a crisis of land or parking. It's a crisis of imagination. So in terms of this, I just want to talk about that smallest scale one I showed for a second, because it's a prototype that might be very interesting to you here in Lexington. What the international code says is that if you build something that's housing that's 3 stories, as long as the ground floor is wheelchair accessible, that does not need an elevator. When it goes taller than that, it needs an elevator. And when you build one elevator, you build two, and then you need a corridor, and then you need fire stairs, and the whole thing turns into a much bigger building. And so that three-story thing is very interesting to us. And there's a different research project where we got asked, well, what could be in between that's a net zero, potentially net zero housing module between a net zero single family house, which we have the technology to do today. There are probably some outside of Lexington today. And a big apartment building, which is very, very hard to make net zero because of all the occupants. And we found that there's the scale, and actually when Brittany and I were driving around, we saw something out near the distillery district that is exactly the scale. By the way, this is where to put the solar panels. You really went on about that. Like, this is very important to you, clearly. What's interesting about the solar panels? So why is this operationally net zero? Not embodied energy. That's a different topic for the people who geek out on this stuff. But operationally, those solar panels in most sunny climates, to include Lexington, generate more power than the residents need. It could actually throw energy back into the grid, which is extraordinary if you think about it. And what's interesting is because it's a single story, it's what's called a single stair module. You could build pretty gracious apartments. I mean, for New York, certainly gracious at about 1,000 square feet, ground floor retail, wheelchair accessible units. And you could do this all without an elevator, without concrete, which means that the construction cost could be very, very low. This is basically the same construction technology as a single family house. So when developers tell you they can't build urban density because it's too expensive, you can show them this. And you can explain that you actually can build urban density at a fairly low cost per square foot, but most importantly, you can house a lot more people. And on that single stair, you can build community. If you haven't seen an elderly neighbor for a while, you know, because that elderly neighbor would use that stair. You absolutely have that connection. It's actually the way we built a lot of urban density all around the world in the early 1900s. And so that's 330 housing units on the left, on the right, and in the middle. And what you understand about that is in the middle, that's 3 stories. It's the same height as a lot of single family homes. That you can build urban space with it. It's a building block. So it's not just about the architecture. It's about what space it can form around it as fabric. And so you can use it as infill or courtyards. You can build it as transit-oriented density near train stations. And so I'm going to close with this just last couple of thoughts. The book is called Architecture of Urbanity, Designing for Nature and Culture and Joy. I firmly believe this, that if you build this thing that I've kind of described as connective design, that creates this idea of positive friction, of this idea that we see difference eyeball to eyeball and we grow and we get better because of it. And that we can then deal with our climate crisis, we can deal with our pluralism crisis, and we can have joy in the places that we live in. And you know, you can say, well, 3-story housing, really, what difference would that make? If we all lived in that module, even at a world where I started of 10.4 billion people, we would use less than 0.5% of the land on the planet to live on, leaving the rest for agriculture, nature, and ocean. Thank you very much.
I'll switch you here. Yes, perfect. Well, that gives us a lot of food for thought. And I'm excited to get to the questions. I think a lot of great questions have been flowing in here. So again, this is just a reminder for Slido. If you have not entered your questions, you can go to slido.com. And again, you type in the code 3550674. You can also go through and like questions. If you give them the thumbs up, they'll raise to the top, and we'll make sure we get to those questions. So we'll dive in here. Excited to get to some of these, because I think that, again, that you've given us a lot to think about in this community that's translatable. We're not New York, but the way that we think about how we accommodate development, at which scales we accommodate it, how we build in neighborhoods, and how we build in ways that bring people together. Just a quick anecdote before we jump into these questions. Today, we went and toured the 325 Main building, which is the new redevelopment at Festival Market that Katie Kaufman and a partner from Texas are working on. And we were just talking about, how do we bring people into the space? And Vishaan mentioned just, yes. So we can look forward to that. Katie loved that idea. So look forward to the 80s dance party. But it was also this idea of how do you program so that people feel invited to a space. And it was even just, programming it for a year, and you have activities and you have events and you bring people and you make people feel welcome. And I think that was just a very simple example of designing for joy and designing for community that goes so far. It might be an office building, it might be a diner, it might be a wine bar. As long as people feel like they're welcome there together in the heart of our downtown, that can go so far. And then it, spurs way more residential development downtown, and all these things are so connected. So I just thank you for that, because I think these are great examples of how those things are connected and how we make a great community even better. Okay, so we will jump into the questions. So the first one, maybe this is an easy one. What's your favorite building that you've seen in Lexington during your visit?
Brittany arranged for me to see the Miller House, which was designed by one of your great architects here who work with Le Corbusier, José Abreu, and the owners were kind enough to let us tour the house. It's out in the southeast part of town, and I've seen pictures of this house for years, and it was such a privilege to be there. So it's an amazing landmark. You should landmark it.
Yeah, so very new thing in Lexington, and that was great to visit, because it is past Jacobson Park, within a Bauhaus subdivision. I mean, it's just this really kind of stunning piece of architecture. Can you speak a little bit on the relationship between urban growth and car dependency?
So I mentioned that I've driven cross country a lot. I love driving cross country. I don't drive in the city. I don't believe in it. I think it's a major pain in the neck. And yet it's something that I spend a huge amount of my time dealing with. We're expanding the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, and the first question that seems to arrive on every American's mind whenever they build anything, anywhere, is where am I going to park? And what's amazing to me, and you don't have this, and be very lucky you don't have this, the number of cities I go to, large and small, across the country, where this kind of space invader landscape of concrete parking garages has beset the downtown. And yet, my client says, well, we've got to build a parking garage. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. You can't swing a cat without hitting a parking garage. But that means the person's going to have to walk a block. And this amazes me. You think about shopping malls, think about how far people walk from their parking space to the Home Depot, and that's not a problem. But somehow, walking to a coffee shop in the middle of the town, like you have to park right out front, and retailers go all crazy if you don't sit, this is a cultural thing, right? And the thing that I would most impress upon people is this. Like, I was just in Venice there's a big architecture thing that happens in Venice every couple of years. And you see all these American tourists. And I can't help but think, this is a completely car-free environment. There's no way to have a car in Venice. And people spend thousands of dollars to visit Venice and the Spanish Steps and favelas in Rio and tight-knit streets in Japan. And they say these environments are so great. And then they go back to their strip mall. And they never think twice about it. Why do we live this way? We don't have to live this way. Because to me, the most important thing about the car thing isn't so much whether it's electric or autonomous or an Uber. As an architect, the first thing I focus on is how much space they take up. And I talked a lot about social connection. Well, how do you have social connection if you're separated from your neighbor by a 3,000-pound tin can? You can't. You can't. Which is why you see in city after city, what do developers do? Go to Los Angeles today, most car-dependent place in the country. What do? They build these places where people can get out of their car and walk around. So you city walk, and like you see these places all over the country, right? We don't have to drive up to the front door of every establishment that we go to. It's okay. And by the way, if you want the best exercise in the world, it's walking, right? It is good for your brain, it's good for your body, it's good for your community. So that's just, I don't even, it doesn't have to be a holier than thou thing. It's a great instrument for some things, camping. It's a lousy instrument for being in places with people.
Gotta whoop. And I would say even just the fiscal efficiency of development that's walkable is another huge part of it.
Well, again, the cost of a car, right? For those of you who are just even if you want to be super selfish about it and just think about your own kids, the numbers don't add up. Your kids, by the way, know this if they're older. The numbers don't add up anymore, right? And so we've got to rethink this. The one thing so the American dream, that idea was written in 1931 by a historian named James Truslow Adams. And it said that the American dream was equal opportunity for every man and woman in the country, regardless of rank or status. You hear anything about cars, houses, anything? You can look it up.
This builds on that a little bit too, and I think it has to do with the re-education, or just that these things are not penciling out, and so we have to think in a new way. And you kind of touched on it before, which it's not a lack of land or resources, it's a lack of imagination. And I think that also connects to the re-education. So this question is, Lexington grew after World War II and grew as a suburban city. How can you re-educate an entire city to convert it to a denser city design? How can we re-educate people about the way they live and get around, and how can you pull it off?
Well, I think we're doing that. There's a lot of writing. My issue with it, and hopefully I'm not doing this, is I try never to berate people. This is a country about freedom. I think people should live the way they want to live. Here's the issue. Since World War II, we've been subsidizing suburban development. It is the biggest thing on the dole in the country, right? We ask, why doesn't Amtrak make money? But do we ask why our highways make money? We ask all of these things of all of these systems that we have, and yet we take it for granted that land should just be out there to be developed willy-nilly, right? And infrastructure costs. And by the way, this isn't a red-blue thing. I mean, in California, I went to architecture school in California right after the Oakland fire, and people living up in the Oakland Hills, everything gets decimated. And it's all been rebuilt exactly as it was. And there's just this expectation that the municipality should provide water with water pressure and fire protection services and all of these things. Or I love it when people say, oh, the bears are attacking the suburbs. The bears didn't attack the suburbs attacked the bears, right? And so we subsidize these things. So what's the interesting question? What would happen if we took away those subsidies, right? Mortgage interest deduction, right, which mainly goes to suburban living. The average house in the country costs about $300,000. People can deduct the interest off their mortgage up to $1.1 million if you're a married couple. Why? They did away with it in the UK. They did away with it in the Netherlands. Congestion pricing. We have this very, very political thing going on in New York City where we're saying, we're going to charge you a lot of money if you want to drive into the central business district and home to 3.5 million people, including me, in the center part of the city, and my kids, and one kid with asthma. We're going to charge you a lot of money if you want to drive into the heart of the city. And what's the thesis? It's a really, actually conservative idea. Adam Smith's conservative, which basically says we're going to charge people for the negative externalities of their behavior. If a factory pollutes a river, you charge the factory to clean up the river. That's actually a very conservative idea. And so if we said, you want to drive into town, it's going to cost you something, right? Because you're taking up space, you're polluting the air, right? And so these are difficult conversations because they're about how people live, and that's really personal, I get it. But I think that if we took away all the subsidies in the system, and my first book talks about this a lot, that you would find people living in much more compact, much more, I don't mean big city, but urban circumstances, right? Because it's just more cost efficient and we're not subsidizing it, right? And so that to me is the conversation we are going to have as a society, because if today it costs double the income that it cost 5 years ago for a person to buy a single family house as a starter home, that doesn't work. So we're going to have this conversation, it seems to me. And we're having it in city after city all across the middle of the country. Forget New York and San Francisco and Boston.
I think those are really good points. And for those of you who joined us for our first session, Will Hanrahan, who's building a small, compact, mixed-use development in one of our industrial areas, was talking about financing and how hard it is to finance different types of units. And I think that goes to the subsidy question as well. If banks make it impossible to build a certain kind of housing or develop a certain kind of housing because of the financial regulations, why aren't we changing those regulations to subsidize and incentivize the type of development that we need to see to house people in an affordable way? This goes back to the parking lot question, and I think, did you say you saw eight surface parking lots from your hotel room at 21C? We've talked, and you all have probably seen statistics about our downtown, and I think it's 38% of our downtown is surface parking lots. Have you seen other communities, or do you have thoughts or ideas or lessons from other places on how do we incentivize the turnover of parking lots? To build on them. That's a challenge here. Do you have any thoughts?
Carrot, stick. Carrot, you give them zoning, you say you own a piece of land, you can build something really pretty dense on it, Stick, if it's anything like most municipalities, we have this reverse taxation thing that says if it's an empty parking lot, your taxes can stay really low. If you build housing on it, your taxes go through the roof because now it's an improved lot, right? It should be exactly the opposite, right? So we should heavily, heavily tax anyone who's land banking, which means not just surface parking, but like just hanging on to like a one-story vacant storefront for all sorts of reasons. And we should just heavily tax that landowner until they see a different course forward.
And it's that question of, right, like what are we subsidizing? Why are we subsidizing people having parking lots? And it is that's a tough policy question and regulation question, but.
And why do we put a lot of tax on multifamily housing when we're trying to get a bunch of people who are going to live in that housing and pay lots of taxes on lots of things, their income, what they buy, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes no sense. It's all reverse.
Another question about community development. I work in community development in very small towns who are often reluctant to try new things. How do you approach new ideas in places with little to no resources?
Well, I mean, like I said, I talked about a lot of places, the book talks about a lot of places in the global south that have far, far, far fewer resources than any place in the United States. So we have a lot of resources. We just pretend we don't. But a lot of this isn't, I mean, zoning, for instance. Zoning, it doesn't cost anything to have the right zoning in your community. It's just a question of everyone getting their minds around it. This tax question we just discussed, that doesn't cost anything. So a lot of it is just policy questions, it seems to me. Things that cost money, building the right parks, building the right mass transit system, even the right bus system or bike lane system, those things cost some money. But usually the benefits from the right kind of city building far outweigh the costs of those things.
I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about the importance of infrastructure, and again, not just roads and things like that, but people-centered infrastructure, your parks, your community spaces, and if you build the right infrastructure, that people will come. And I think that is a conversation we're having throughout Lexington as well, about investing in our infrastructure, investing in our parks, investing in our public spaces, and how development will come and be drawn there, but we have to incentivize.
One thing that's important, COVID was a big test case for a lot of our communities. And one of the things that I've seen communities that are far, far, far more impacted by COVID still 5 years later than this community is. And that's because there is, to me, a clear kind of quality of life here. There's sidewalks, there's street trees. Those things don't exist in a lot of big cities in the United States, and even mid-sized cities. It's kind of extraordinary. Those things will become more and more important as our cities are challenged. Like, so for instance, we were talking about today, 5 years from now, AI could threaten a lot of the service jobs in your town. Accounting, law, right? And if that happens, what is the economic backbone of the city? So it's interesting, New York, during the pandemic, it had a horrible, horrible experience with the pandemic, like many places did, like every place did. But it recovered from the pandemic very quickly because it's got this tremendous residential population, right? That believes in it, invested in it, wants to sustain itself. And so that's a really learnable lesson, that quality of life and having a residential population that wants to be here no matter what, right, is going to be really important, because we don't, I worked for the city of New York after 9/11. We never know what next thing is going to blindside us, right? But having that resilience of community in terms of quality of life and people who believe in a place is usually the thing that gets you through it.
Changing gears a little bit, I know as Vishaan and I were driving through town, we were driving through kind of the area between downtown and the university. And I think these questions relate to that a little bit. And the questions are about maximum height of a multi-unit or apartment building in a residential setting. And I think generally how modern designs can be made compatible with historic neighborhoods. We saw some of those on our drive. As the need for development increases, how do we make those two things live in harmony with each other?
So I'm of two minds about this. So I showed you the thing about how you can have a multifamily, 6 units, 10 units, live in a single family neighborhood, heights being somewhat equal, some of the construction materials being somewhat equal. But the reason I'm of two minds is this question, if you're tall, do you only have tall friends? Right? It's like, to me, it's a really funny question, this need for homogeneity. We're Americans. We pride ourselves on this idea of individualism, and yet it's little pink houses for you and me. And I've never quite understood it. That sense of needing homogeneity as some kind of cultural bomb that we're all together. If you go to older cultures, if you walk the streets of Paris or Vienna or Tokyo, you will find things that are much older than anything in the United States, sitting cheek by jowl with some of the most modern architecture in the world. And everyone's cool with it. Everyone's fine with it. But I'll tell you the one difference. It's of quality, right? The difference is it isn't just some flat developer box, no umbrage taken, please, by the developers, but let's face it, we can do better. And even like seeing the Miller House today, which sits in this suburban subdivision, it's extraordinary. I think sometimes contrast is important, right? The question is the quality of the contrast. So I think, yes, you can make things that are harmonious, but that doesn't mean that you should reject a lack of harmony if it makes you think and if it's a quality argument for how things could be different. Because we should be confronted with questions like that. We don't have to all be the same.
We talked a little bit about this today as well, about projects that are driven by the public sector, projects that are driven by the private sector, and the benefits in a lot of places of public-private partnerships. How necessary are public funds to incentivize smart growth or responsible growth in communities?
Critical. And like I said, we subsidize the suburbs. We've been doing this with public money for a long, long, long time, right? We use public money. I mean, the whole history of this country, the New Deal, the Tennessee Valley Authority, we have time and time again done this. And I think that we really need to have a conversation around what is the federal role in housing and how can the federal role be better. Right now it's had a pretty tough history. And then locally, we do use tax incentives to get developers over the hump sometimes, low interest financing, other things. One of the biggest challenges, because I've beaten up developers, so I'm going to try to throw a bone here. You mentioned financing. A lot of commercial financing for multifamily housing is incredibly conservative, and it wants a Starbucks versus a local coffee shop because the Starbucks helps the loan underwriting and things like that. It wants the cheaper facade as opposed to something that is more exuberant. And that's just the way the banking system works, even if the developer wants to build something better. And so that's where public money can be really critical to say we need to think about these things long term. The reason Princeton builds a better building than an average real estate developer is because Princeton knows that building is going to be on its campus for a century, right? Whereas a developer has to think about a building as an asset that it can exit from, that he or she can exit from in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, because that's what the bank demands. And so the patient capital of public money is really important in terms of building quality, it seems to me.
Absolutely. If you could pick a single element that is most important to your design philosophy, what would it be?
Bourbon. Sorry, just on the mind. What we like to say when we design things, and this lecture was purposely not that much about architecture, right? Because of what you do and what the kind of city is debating. But a couple of things. We like to say that you have to read before you write. So we spend a lot of time at a site, in a place, with its people, with the land, before we propose something. And so things like that round arch at the top of Domino came from a deep research into the building. And so, again, I really believe that so much of why people have trouble with contemporary architecture is that they don't see themselves in it in any way. And what we like to do is to say, we can channel a place's narratives, but also in a way that challenges you. And doesn't give you like an easy contextual response, but gives you something that makes you think about the place that you live in, the environment you live in. I think that's the center of it.
It seems, sorry, the question I was going to ask just disappeared. Let's see, besides the urban growth boundary, what feature of Lexington struck you as the most unique?
Again, this identity thing. I mean, I loved when we were, what's the geographic thing called? The FRASC, what was it? The underlying geology that we were talking about?
Karst.
The karst. This thing about the limestone and how that, helps to feed the equestrian culture, but also, feeds the bourbon history, and like those things that make a place unique are something that I think that in the world we live in, between the stuff on our phones and the plastic nature of our environments, that we lose contact with as human beings. And I think those things are so incredibly grounding and important, especially as we go through the big traumatic events of our lives, that those are the things that kind of make us feel like we are somewhere and not just anywhere. And so I'm sure I've been in the city for less than 24 hours, so I'm sure there are many, many other things like this. But I think grabbing those things and amplifying them in your environment, whether that's through programming or music or through the architecture or through the parks or whatever it is incredibly grounding and important for people's health.
Well, you've only been here for a short time, but you got the keys. You got karst topography and you got bourbon, and I think that's important too. And this kind of goes back to the discussion about, building in historic neighborhoods. And I do think the history of a place and those things are grounding pieces that we always have to think about that make design and investing in community spaces worthwhile when we pull those things together. Another great question. It seems that urbanity is characterized by high density. What factors help encourage people to embrace density?
I think it's encouraged not by high density. That's kind of the point of me trying to separate the word urbanity from big cities. I don't think you need big city density. To get really geeky and plannerly about it, usually about 30 units per acre is enough to support busing, biking, a light rail system. 30 units per acre is a very modest height. Embrace density. I think the biggest thing about this is, and that's why the word joy is in the title of my book, this isn't about people eating their spinach. This isn't about me saying to people, you've got to live this way. What I'm trying to say is there are ways to live that you might actually find more joyful, more connective to the people around you, right? And density is a vehicle for that, but it's not the goal, right? The goal is for people to have better lives. Just a modest amount of density can help people achieve that. That's really the argument. And if people don't want to do that, they don't have to do it. But they also need to understand that then they might be polluting the river more, and they might need to pay more for polluting the river more.
We're going to get to two more questions. And the first is, can you help define the quality of a building? Do the designs include resilient principles and energy efficiency while also considering affordability?
Super good questions, but I think all of those define the quantity of the building, not the quality of the building. And they're super important metrics, each and every one of them. I'm not saying they're not. But they're the practical things of policy. And those things are important. But the quality of a building is, to me, something much more ineffable, something much harder to kind of fully put into words and fully measure. And people struggle with this because we love metrics, right? We love metrics. But I can't always explain to a client why one solution is better than another. I have to just somehow rely on the fact that I've been doing this for 30 years and I think it's better. Other people might disagree. That's okay. But what I do know is like Domino's incredibly popular with people who know nothing about architecture. I get all sorts of incoming about it when I'm there at the site. And I think there are things about certain buildings that make us feel better, right? And you just know it. You know it in your heart, just like a landscape can make you feel better when you're around them. And that's the quality of the building. And I don't know it's a deeply humanistic thing, and I don't know how to put metrics around that.
All right, we're actually going to do 2 more questions.
Okay.
But there's so many good
You're
ones.
good. I've seen very few
I
people
know,
leave, which
I
I'm
know.
kind of astonished by.
What tips do you have for communicating with the public and bringing them on board with a program like you touched on in your speech? What have you seen or had success with in engaging the public and community in your project?
In addition to speaking in language that hopefully people understand, which I think is really important. I mean, one of the issues in architecture school is we tend to butcher language for reasons I've never fully understood. But one of the things we find that's very, very helpful are these before and after images. I didn't show it today because it would take up the entire hour, but I've had this lifelong thing to try to fix Penn Station in New York City. If you've been to Penn Station in New York City, it's our national embarrassment. And we put out a bunch of proposals, and one of the ways we help people understand those proposals are before and after images. So we go and we take a fair picture of the existing thing, and then we'll show a kind of replacement image of what it could be. And because it's a view or a photograph that is accessible to people and they've experienced it, that before and after really helps people ground it. And so, one of the things is I don't expect for the non-architects in the room for you to be architects. That's not your job. It's my job to explain it to you in a way that you'll understand. And so we have all sorts of computer tools to do that, but I think speaking in kind of plain language is also super important.
Absolutely. Well, there were so many good questions. We're going to end on one. And again, you've been in Lexington in a very short time, but I saw this pop up before and I wanted to remember it. What's one thing, even from your brief tour, that we could do or fix in the next 5 years that would have an impact for generations?
I'm going to mention 3 things.
All right, even better.
Build urban housing, build urban housing, build urban housing.
You heard it here.
You've got plenty of land and plenty of opportunity to do this, and it will double down on what the community already is if you do it right. But urban housing, by saying that, I don't mean just multifamily. I mean housing of quality, right? So it shouldn't just be a developer bonanza where people build a bunch of crap in a very beautiful city, right? But you can do this. This is a place with resources, right? And it is much, much better than breaking your urban growth boundary and making this place the same place as virtually every other place that you drive through in this country. You don't want to do this to yourselves, right? Because you were given a gift. And I think it's really important to double down on that gift. And you will see, and there's city after city that has examples of this. San Antonio, Texas, Nashville's gone a little crazy, but there's a lot of places around the country, big and small, that are exemplars of this. And so I just think, especially in a university town, you will not regret this, and I think you've got all the means in front of you to do it.
Please give Vishaan a final round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.